and welcome back to my channel. Bonsoir et re-bienvenue sur ma chaîne. My name is Muriel, and in this video I will be doing a book review for The Priory of the Orange Tree, written by Samantha Shannon. This is somewhat unusually a standalone fantasy novel in the high fantasy subgenre more specifically. It is fairly chunky, as you can see. It stands at about 800 pages, so not the chunkiest standalone fantasy novel I've read, but still, it's up there. It's also a fantasy story which is both female and dragon-centric, taking place in a world that isn't by default patriarchal or even traditionally Western medieval. I guess it's more equivalent to a very late Renaissance to early Enlightenment age setting because firearms exist in this world. However, I don't personally think this is feminist literature specifically, contrarily to what some of the blurbs say, and I hate blurbs, but you know, they say this is feminist Tolkien, what's feminist Game of Thrones. No, it's not really feminist at all in its themes, but yes, it is female-centric. That's the more accurate denomination. I loved a lot about this book, up until about the 80 to 90% point. Then I was very bitterly disappointed by the ending, and because by the ending, some world building and plot elements felt deeply unresolved and as such unsatisfactory to me, and I couldn't ignore that. Priory of the Orange Tree takes place in, like I said, a high fantasy world, which I guess is somewhat equivalent technology-wise to the late Renaissance, early Enlightenment era. This world is geographically divided into two main continents, an eastern one and a western one, and even the western continent is culturally divided into northwest and south. This world, 1,000 years prior to the beginning of the events in Priory of the Orange Tree, was on the brink of destruction because another characteristic of this world is the existence of dragons. But there are two kinds of dragons, one specific to the east, which are called simply dragons and are associated with water, rain, the ocean, lightning, and western fire-breathing worms, which breathe fire and bring upon human beings a kind of plague. So those fire-breathing worms almost wipe the world out, and you are told that certain heroic figures banished the leader of that draconic army, and the descendants of one of those heroic figures is, you are told, what keeps that draconic leader chained up in the very deep ocean which separates the western and eastern continents. In the present day, this descendant is Queen Sabran, I'm not really sure how you're supposed to pronounce her name. She is the queen of the queendom of Innis. To her court comes a character named Ed, who comes from the south and is, you quickly come to realize, a mage from the Priory of the Orange Tree. And so she is given the mission of making sure that this queen bears an heir. So the spell that keeps this draconic leader, called the Nameless One, will be maintained, and that creature will be kept in the abyss between the two continents. And you also have a branch of the story taking place on the eastern continent. You have Tane, who is training to become a dragon rider in her country's army, and an exiled alchemist called Nicholas, who's banished from the court of Queen Sabran to this little trading outpost in Tane's country, which is called Seiki. Unfortunately, however, a lot of the dragons which were in the Nameless One's army, so we're talking about the fire-breathing worms here, are still extant. They are slumbering away in the wild places of the west and south. They're starting to wake up in increasing numbers, which shouldn't be possible because the Queen of Innis is still alive. So some key characters are starting to ask themselves the question, is she really the one keeping the Nameless One in chains? And how is the East connected to all this? How are the dragons of the East connected to the fire-breathing worms? And the story largely takes off from there. So first, a note on the writing. I really enjoyed the writing in this book. I was fairly impressed, actually. To me, it was a lovely, delightful blend of contemporary and more classical styles of fantasy writing with a very good level of vocabulary, including very specific setting-appropriate words. So not just generic words, perhaps more suitable for a more commercial audience, but words which at times I had to look up in a dictionary. Some people find that annoying. I find that enriching. I like learning new things and new words, because as far as I'm concerned, the more accurate the vocabulary, the better. It's also a highly structured novel in the sense that there's 6 different parts, each containing multiple different chapters. Each chapter follows one of 4 main characters, so it's a multiple points of view story. There are 2 main female characters and 2 main male ones. Each chapter is also headed by a geographical pointer, so it either takes place in the east, the south, or the west, so you know at all times where you are in that world and where the characters are in that world. And pacing-wise, I thought there was very good pacing overall throughout the book. Neither too slow, neither too fast, or I mean, slow at times because it needed to be, and faster at times because it needed to be. Unfortunately, that applies only up until the 80 to 90% point, because I do think the ending was rushed, and a lot of the stakes that had been raised throughout the entire narrative felt diminished, and so, yeah, that general denouement was very underwhelming. That is undeniably a major flaw of this novel. I was overall quite satisfied with the character work and the amount of character development most of the main characters actually get. Like I said, it's a 4 points of view story with 2 main male characters and 2 main female characters. The female characters being Tane from Seiki, Ayad from the Priory of the Orange Tree, the 2 main male characters being Loth from the Queendom of Innis, and Nicolas Roos, an alchemist from the Free State of Mentendon, which is an allied state of the Queendom of Innis. That last one was in fact probably one of my favourite characters, or at least the character that had the most satisfying arc to me, but I mean all of the main characters and even some of the secondary characters go through a bit of character development, and most of it was very satisfying. Basically the character work was just good enough for my personal taste, but keep in mind, I'm not the most character-driven reader either. The character relationships were also very engaging. What I really liked is that there was a strong focus on and valuing of friendship and platonic love. It's clearly put forward that it's as important as romantic/erotic love. There was also a bit of romance, although thankfully not too much for my taste, and what's more, homosexual romances. There is not directly on the page, it's thought about a lot, but there is an important gay male romance. I mean, important to one of the main characters in any case, one of the main male characters, and there is an ongoing, or I mean a developing lesbian romance as well, which I personally found very satisfying. Which also means there's excellent gay representation in this novel. To me, it was the perfect kind of representation, insofar as there's no fuss made about it, it's just there, it's largely accepted, it's not seen as deviant or abnormal, so to me that was great. A lot of the story and the world building also revolves around these more mythical figures, though one of those figures might still be alive by the time of the story of Priory of the Orange Tree. And I found those figures intriguing. I enjoyed learning about the lore surrounding those characters, and I enjoyed the very obvious parallels that are drawn between a lot of these older mythical figures and some of the main characters in the story. However, I would also point out that, in my opinion, those parallels weren't always executed as well as they could have been. Sometimes they felt incomplete, and as such, they felt a bit confusing, unsatisfying, and uncommitted to in a way at times, but that's just a more general problem with the world building, which I'll get to in a few minutes. Now I'm going to talk about the themes before the world building, because in the world building section there will be a spoilerful section as well. Theme-wise, this is again one of those stories which isn't as heavy with its theming, or not as involved and rich with its theming as other works of SFF literature, which is fine. It doesn't always have to be super strong on the theming, right? Though that is generally my preference, but whatever. However, I'll definitely point to a pretty significant theme of what are the consequences of misinterpreting very old stories on your religion and your politics. And by that I mean they're different cultures that have different religions and different foundation stories, basically, but going off of the same basic story. It's a bit like, I guess, the Abrahamic religions, which all go off of the Ancient Testament, but then go in their own unique ways, though they're still very much related. And here you have at least 2 different religions, which are very similar, but they diverge because they interpret certain events from the distant past, 1,000 years ago, in a few key ways. And you see the ridiculous amounts of fighting that causes in the present, because it's all about who has the correct version of the truth. Even the character who has the more correct version of the truth gets pretty arrogant about it at times, and I was like, look dude, stop being that way. You're complaining that the people in front of you are being idiots because they're defending an inaccurate version of the truth. And your version might be more accurate, but then you learn later on in the story that she's also missing a lot of information and a lot of context for what actually happened 1,000 years ago. And you're just confronted by the fact that all of this is pretty stupid at the end of the day, that people are fighting over this stuff when it doesn't really even matter that much. I mean, it does matter to the unfolding of events because there's magic and it's fancy, etc. But for living your life day to day, does it actually really matter? What matters are the values you choose to follow, the values you choose to uphold in your society, rather than the super precise accuracy of what this or that mythical figure did 1,000 years ago. I thought it was presented in, I guess, a bit of a different way than I'm used to. And I was like, yeah, you really went there and you explored this with some respectable depth. And apart from that, I'm just going to point to more of a thematic thread or a message, if you will. I mean, it's, I guess, somewhat generic, though I think it's still valuable. And that would be the benefits of overcoming difference, which might result from, different interpretations of events in the distant past, differences of religion, of ways of structuring power, things like that, cultural differences more generally, overcoming those differences to achieve a greater goal that will benefit everyone. And it also kind of points to international cooperation, though that all kind of goes together, really. And finally, I think there is a thematic motif, a world-building motif that has to do with equilibrium and the importance of maintaining balance in all things, or at least on different levels of existence, whether on a more personal level or on a more cosmic level. However, I don't think that theme or thematic motif or world-building motif, whatever you want to call it, I don't think it was executed particularly well. That's where a lot of my issues reside, but I will get into more detail in a few seconds in the world-building section. So yeah, thematically, it's not the most impressive work of SFF literature. However, that theme of just examining what you think you know about the world and its history, I thought that was really well done. So I definitely want to give props for that. So most of my issues have to do with aspects of the world building, with plot development and resolution. However, I'm going to start off with the very positive aspects of the world building. So like I said in the introduction, this is a fairly original setting for high fantasy. It's nothing truly revolutionary either. You'll recognize a lot of very familiar things. So it's familiar but fresh at the same time, with that early Enlightenment era type setting, with a female-centric focus, with a queendom instead of a kingdom. However, that queendom, interestingly enough, is very reminiscent of like medieval Europe. Its religion revolves around the 6 virtues of chivalry, basically. You would expect that to be heavily patriarchal, but it's not. I've seen some readers on Goodreads point to that as being a bit of an issue for them, as being not quite realistic enough. I understand where they're coming from, because there was a point I had to pause in my reading and think to myself, would that make sense without a patriarchal societal structure? It's a bit hard to wrap your head around. However, I do think it can work, and does work in this novel. You also have those cultures on the Eastern continent, which are reminiscent of ancient China, ancient Japan. It's fairly obvious also with the linguistic inspirations. You also have the South, which is reminiscent of Arab culture and more African cultures, perhaps. But I thought that, made the world richer, and I enjoyed that, honestly. I'll also add, as big pluses in my book, that there are maps for this book. There's also a glossary for certain words which are just part of the English language, and some words which the author invented to go with her world building. There is a timeline given for the major events of that world's history, and there's also an index of all the major and secondary, even some tertiary characters. And then there's just a beautiful usage of classical draconic lore put on display in this book, and playing around with it as well, and playing around with like the traditional stories of dragons being slain by knights and knights rescuing princesses. But is that what really happened though? And by classical draconic lore, I mean using lots of different words to refer to different kinds of draconic creatures. Amphipters, basilisks, cockatrices, wyverns, worms. Even, is the word lung used? I'm not entirely sure, but the descriptions given of the eastern dragons, which are aligned with water, rain, the sky, lightning, those are clearly Eastern-style dragons. They're very serpentine. Some, however, do have wings, which is described in traditional mythology about Eastern dragons. And even the number of toes are different between dragons that come from the Japanese-inspired Seiki or the Chinese-inspired Empire of the 12 Lakes. Because once again, Korean dragons, Japanese dragons, and Chinese dragons have different numbers of toes, which isn't something you would know unless you're a dragon nerd. So I was like, Nice little display of draconic lore there. And there's the magic. The magic system is pretty straightforward, pretty light because there aren't that many magic users. Magic usage is very rare and very limited. It's dependent on the consumption of fruit or gems that come from the sky. So I'm going to put it. I'm not going to say any more than that until I get to the spoilerful section. And there are lots of parallels drawn between dragons, the magic system, and the balance of the world, which all kind of turns around symbolic alchemical imagery, and I love that stuff. All these references to mythology, esotericism, I love that stuff. Unfortunately, I felt it was uncommitted to. It wasn't developed to its fullest potential, and there were inconsistencies in that world building. In all those parallels drawn, revolving around that symbolic imagery of balance, of kind of the yin and yang. And that was terribly disappointing. The thing is, I kept expecting additional lore to come in to explain away those inconsistencies, to smooth out some of the plot contrivances that were linked to those world-building inconsistencies. I got to, I don't know, page 760-something, and I still wasn't getting that additional lore. I wasn't getting what I thought was supposed to be additional answers. And by the end, I never got those answers. So I was left feeling very disconcerted and disappointed because it just had so much potential with all that imagery and that symbolism. And to be even more specific, now I'm going to jump into spoiler territory, so if you don't want to know anything about this, skip ahead to my concluding remarks. It's very clear that dragons and magic are linked, and those are linked to two main forces of the world of the Priory of the Orange Tree. You are told that there are two kinds of magic. There is Sidon, which is earth fire magic, and there is Sterin, which is celestial starlight magic. It is also stated that magic is neutral. It can be used for good purposes, it can be used for evil purposes. Dragons are corporeal manifestations of those two kinds of magic. Eastern dragons, which are associated with rain, lightning, the sky, are entirely benevolent creatures. They are allies of humankind, they are worshipped as deities, they bring rain to feed the crops, they are ridden by warriors, they are clearly good beings and nothing else. But the fire-breathing worms, however, are evil creatures of destruction. They burn shit to the ground, they spread a draconic plague, they're organized in a very hierarchical fashion and led by this monstrous nameless one, who is this ginormous fire-breathing dragon of the classical Western type. They're also wyverns and basilisks and cockatrices. All those things are bad fire-breathing worms. And they're evil. You're told that they're a manifestation of Sidon, coalesced out of the core of the earth, whilst Eastern dragons are a manifestation of starlight fallen to the earth in the form of comets and things like that. But this doesn't actually make sense if you think about it, because if magic is neutral and the forces of the universe are in a state of balance, starlight is not evil, fire is not evil in itself. You need both for the world to function and continue its existence. That's the imagery you're presented with in the book in any case. Then why are the dragons so sharply divided into good and evil entities? What's more is that the magic users, except for one, Caliber, are all good as well. Sidon, being manifested corporeally in dragons, is evil. The dragons are fire breathers and they destroy everything. However, the human beings who use Sidon are good. They're the handmaidens of the Priory of the Orange Tree. It doesn't corrupt them. They use their Sidon for good, but that good is killing dragons, which are a manifestation of their magic. See, that's where it kind of all fell apart for me, because that central symbolic imagery of balanced duality, complementary duality, very akin to the yin and yang symbolism, it wasn't committed to in a way, to allow for certain plot contrivances, I guess, because you needed that conflict between a big bad, an antagonist, and the good humans and their Eastern Dragon companions. But it doesn't really respect that central imagery at the core of the book's world building. So I was like, no, I can't buy this. Why? I was sure there was going to be some kind of plot and world building twist towards the end of the book, and it never came. It was so incredibly frustrating. Also, there's this thing about the fruit trees. There are 3 fruit trees, 3 firstborn, Caliba and the hawthorn tree, Neporo and the mulberry tree, Clearland and the orange tree. Both the hawthorn and the mulberry trees are dead by the time of Priory of the orange tree. Why is the orange tree still alive? That's never really explained, because it was tended by the handmaidens? See, that again was just a bit convenient. Oh yeah, the good guys of the Priory of the orange tree, they have their orange tree to rely on, but the other 2 trees are dead. Neporo is dead. Caliba's still alive though, and Caliba, I thought that she had the potential of being a really, really interesting, morally grey character, and she is, but at the end I thought the author kind of relied on the evil witch trope a bit too much, and I just expected more from that character. I also felt sure she was going to spill a lot more tea on her relationship to the other 2 firstborn, Neporo and Clearland. I felt there was lore missing about that Clearland figure as well. See, all these little things didn't add up for me. And with regards to that ending, the thing is, you're told that in the distant past, Clearland and Neporo, these 2 witches, used Sidon and Sterin in conjunction to seal the Nameless One away in the abyss. And they died doing so, even though they were rendered immortal by consumption of their respective fruits. In the story of the Priory of the Orange Tree, however, Tane and Ead basically don't have any kind of price to pay for their feats of heroic valor. They destroy the Nameless One, which I might add should throw the world into a state of massive imbalance, because if all the fire-breathing dragons die, why are the Eastern dragons still alive, which are aligned with Starlight? See, again, that central symbolism is not respected. And so those 2 female characters survive their encounter with the Nameless One, and they don't pay any kind of price. They retain their magic, and you know, everyone lived happily ever after. I'm not saying they should have died, like, not everyone has to be George R.R. Martin and kill their characters left, right, and center, but they should have paid some kind of price. The stakes had been raised to such a high level, and they were rendered meaningless by the ending. In the end, I gave The Priory of the Orange Tree a 7.5 out of 10. It was so incredibly difficult for me to rate this novel, let me tell you. I was sure it was going to be an 8 out of 10, perhaps even a bit more. And then at the end, I was so pissed off and disappointed, I wanted to give it a 6.5 to 7 out of 10. Then I reasoned with myself and reminded myself that I really loved a lot about this book, and there is a lot to commend in this book. So yeah, I guess a 7.5 is the most accurate amalgamation of all my feelings and thoughts regarding Priory of the Orange Tree. I was bitterly disappointed by that ending. I was bitterly disappointed by the plot contrivances, the annoying amounts of plot armor some characters also had, and by the inconsistencies in the world building, in the core symbolism at the heart of that world building. However, I also really enjoyed the ride, and I got delicious little whiffs of A Song of Ice and Fire. Note, I use the word whiff. It's not like A Song of Ice and Fire, but I was reminded of certain notes akin to those you get in A Song of Ice and Fire, akin to those you get in the Earthsea cycle, akin also to some notes you get in The Mists of Avalon. I got whiffs of all of these other works of fantasy literature, and they were very enjoyable, obviously, but of course, it was its own thing as well. Familiar, but fresh as well. Female-centric, but not feminist, and dragon-centric in a delightful way. Though again, I think the story could have gone a lot further with all that traditional draconic lore, with the symbolism at the heart of its narrative, etc, etc. So I would recommend you check this out if you're in the mood for a chunky high fantasy standalone. It was a fun ride at the end of the day. I enjoyed the characters, the character interactions, a lot of the world building, that core theme of, misinterpreting the distant past and what happens when peoples do that. So yeah, check it out if it seems appealing to you, and a lot of people love this novel. I'm just a very nitpicky bitch, as you all know, when it comes to world building and theming and plot development, because that's just the way I am, but it probably won't bother a lot of other readers. And that concludes my review of The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. I hope you all have a lovely day, evening, or whichever time of day you prefer. Take good care of yourselves, and I shall see you all again reasonably soon in the next video. Bye bye!